And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather showing this storm system tracking due east right across Bristol Bay and into just about over Kamishak Bay later tonight after midnight with gusty west-northwest winds, gale force winds behind this. High wind warning ends for the Pribilof Islands at 7 p.m. this evening, and the coastal flood advisory here for Bristol Bay ends at 10 p.m. this evening. Otherwise, look for rain here with this front across southern Alaska and spreading into the northern panhandle and up toward the coastline there. To the north, drier conditions, especially on the east side, all the way up to the Arctic coast. A little bit more showery back here to the west with a couple of disturbances. One there along the northwest coast, and another thing here along the Yukon Delta coastline on the north there. And then showers ending as an area high pressure develops over the central Aleutians, kind of ridges northward there. And then for tomorrow, this low continues to move east and slowly weaken, and rain persisting or becoming more showery for Cook Inlet. But it looks like periods of rain for the North Gulf Coast into the Copper River Basin northward there, across the eastern Alaska Range all the way up to the Yukon River, and then back to the southwest here with quite a bit of shower activity along the western Alaska Range as well as the northern Kuskokwim Valley, and then drying out toward the coastline there. Showers back to the northwest. This front keeps it wet over the panhandle with periods of rain and a little on the breezy side, especially on the north coast there in the afternoon. High pressure shifting eastward here over the Bering Sea. Much lighter winds now for the Pribilof Islands, eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula. Winds also coming down here for the southwest coast. And back to the west here, you can see the next system, actually just a warm front there, pushing an increasing chance of light rain, fog, and drizzle to shimmy in at too. That system comes on the map a little bit better for Thursday afternoon with the front crossing the far western Aleutians there. To the east of that, really the central eastern Bering Sea under the domination of high pressure centered in the Yukon coast here. A couple of disturbances coming around the northern perimeter of that will produce some shower activity there for the Seward Peninsula into the Yukon Delta. Another one back through here, keeping it showery and cloudy for the Tanana Valley from about Denali Park right up to Eagle northward. On in toward Canada there around Old Crow. More showers here for the western North Slope, especially the Brooks Range area, and showery for the southeast coast. But clearing here across southern Alaska. Look for a dry day with increasing sunshine here, south central Alaska, the North Gulf Coast, into Bristol Bay, with this system at least initially staying to the south and probably heading more into the southeast coast. Coastal water forecast, south winds 15 to 20 knots on the south coast, south to southwest winds 15 to 20 knots on the central coast, and the north coast south to southeasterlies at 15 knots with seas running 6 to 9 feet along the entire coastline. Small craft advisories for Lynn Canal, south winds 25 knots, and Stevens Passage, south winds 25 gusting 40 knots, and Clarence Strait, south at 15. Southeast winds at 15 knots for Clarence Strait on Thursday, and for Lynn Canal and Stevens Passage, southerlies at 15 knots. West winds 20 knots for the south coast with 10-foot seas, and west and then becoming east here, but pretty light up on the north coast there. Those easterlies at about 10 knots, these just under 10 feet. Prince William Sound, southeasterlies 15 knots for tomorrow. South to southwest 15 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast. Western North Gulf Coast looking at west winds there at 20 knots. And then small craft advisories, Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands here northwest becoming west as that low center pulls into off to the east here. That's when the winds will be the strongest there, about 30 knots with seas 9 to 8 feet. Otherwise, Cook Inlet looking at north winds 15 to 20 knots. For Thursday, Cook Inlet, north winds 10 to 15 knots with 2 to 3 foot seas. Still looking at small craft advisories here for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands for 30 knot winds. And light variable winds for the eastern North Gulf Coast at about 10 knots. Prince William Sound, northwest winds at 10 knots. Kodiak Island tomorrow, gale warnings, west winds 35 to 40 knots. And for the Alaska Peninsula here, we've got 25 to 35 knot winds out of the west and a good westerly gale, especially in the morning hours for Bristol Bay with seas at about 14 feet. And then for Thursday, much lighter and more variable winds here for the Alaska Peninsula at 10 to 15 knots here in the afternoon, kind of becoming east there on the west side of the peninsula. Bristol Bay, north winds 10 knots. Kodiak Island, west winds diminishing to 20 knots, seas subsiding to 5 feet. And for Unalaska Island, west winds 20 knots tomorrow. But for Nikolsky, on out to Adak, light variable winds at 10 knots under high pressure. And then as you head west here, look for south winds at 20 knots from Kiska to Shemya. And then for the day on Thursday, east-southeast winds, 25 knots there west of Kiska Island. Otherwise, 15-knot winds here, mostly from the east around Atka and Adak. And for the eastern Aleutians, east winds at 15 knots with seas 4 to 5 feet. And for the southwest coast, strongest wind south of Nunivak Island out of the northwest at 30 knots, otherwise northwest 20 knots for the Yukon Delta coastline. St. Lawrence Island, small craft advisories, northwest 25, northwest at 20 for Norton Sound, west 20 for St. Matthew Island, and a lot lighter winds for the Pribilofs out of the west at 15 knots. And then those become light and variable here for the Pribilofs and actually much of the Bering Sea under high pressure. Lights west-southwest breeze to the southwest coast at 10 knots and west at 15, St. Lawrence Island. Still looking at 20-knot westerlies there in Norton Sound. And for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast tomorrow, northeast winds 10 to 15 knots. Winds out of the east at 15 for the central coast and the west side, northwest, northeast on the west side at 15 knots. And the Chukchi Sea, north to northwest winds 10 to 25 knots. And then for Thursday, the Chukchi Sea, west-southwest winds 15 to 20 knots, and the western Arctic coast, north to northwest at 10 knots, central coast, northwest at 10, and the east side there looking at west winds at 10 to 20 knots.